Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this SICC, the ASEAN series webinar, this time on Malaysia. This series is in collaboration with Control Risks, which is a chamber member, and of course, Enterprise Singapore on this occasion for our very important next door neighbor. We've got two speakers, one each from Control Risks and Enterprise Singapore. We've got Harrison Cheng from Control Risks and Mr. Khairul Anwar from Enterprise Singapore. Harrison will go first, and he will help us understand the political issues, and let's be honest, there are plenty of them right now, the COVID restrictions and the business risks. Khairul will then follow Harrison and will talk about macroeconomics, long-term prospects, and sectoral opportunities. And the whole idea of this series of webinars on important ASEAN markets is to provide you, our members and friends, with insights on these markets that form a critical part in your business, in many cases, but also for the future of Singapore's economic sustainability. ASEAN is a very important marketplace. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Harrison. I will be back after both presentations to moderate the Q&A. And if you've got any questions, please at any time use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type them in. You can vote for those questions that you like most, and that'll make my job as moderator a bit easier. So Harrison, with great pleasure, over to you.
Thank you, Victor. Let me share screen first. I hope everyone can see my slides now. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us here, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk about Malaysia and its political outlook for the second half of this year, or what's left of it. So without further ado, let me get into the briefing. This is the general outline that I will follow today. I'll first start with covering the latest state of play, and by latest I mean as of last night. Even more political developments have taken place in Putrajaya, and I will cover and bring everyone up to speed on what's the latest developments. I will then move into possible pathways, what is likely to happen in terms of political scenarios in the second half of this year. And then I'll talk a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic in Malaysia. Obviously, that is a key development in Malaysia right now, and the question on everyone's minds is probably, will this wave end and when would it end? And then I'll finally move on to the headline business risks and opportunities in the coming months, and I frame this section as a price of politics because I want to show how politics is not an academic kind of phenomenon, right? It has real and deep implications for the living conditions of Malaysians every day, for how businesses can operate within Malaysia. And so politics is not to be seen as kind of like a variable that just happens within its own silo, but it affects all aspects of business. And I think businesses have felt this painfully in the past few months. And finally, let's not be paralyzed by all the chaos and all the signs of disorder. There are things that businesses can do in response to these risks and opportunities. These are things that we have advised our clients who have faced these issues in Malaysia over the past few months. So I do want to share a bit of that as well because it's practical, it's concrete, it's actionable. And I think that is something that I would like everyone to take away from this webinar today. So latest state of play, 12th of August. What is the situation right now? So I'll try to capture this as succinctly as possible because the to and fro is just too much to cover in the space of 20 minutes. But I will not spend more than 3 minutes on this. Essentially, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin is one of three key players, political players to watch in this current political situation. he has been presiding over a ruling coalition that a few months ago had a simple majority in parliament, about 110 or 111 seats out of 222 seats in parliament. That meant that he had the mandate to remain in power. But since then, many developments have taken place that have threatened and actually eroded that simple majority. And he is facing threats both internally within his ruling coalition and externally in the opposition camp. And that's where I introduced the other two players, one of which is UMNO President, Ahmad Zahid Hamidi, or Zahid as we call him. UMNO is a part of the ruling coalition, but is extremely unhappy with Muhyiddin and his party Bersatu. Why? Because they feel that, he feels that Bersatu essentially has monopolized a lot of cabinet positions, a lot of government-linked appointments. And so Zahid is unhappy because he, number one, wants to be prime minister. Number two, he has many corruption charges against him. So he fears that he could end up like Najib last year when he was convicted for corruption. And thirdly, Zahid wants to return UMNO to the position that it had prior to the 2018 general election, where UMNO essentially had led the Barisan Nasional government for decades. And therefore, Zahid wants to reclaim the UMNO as the preeminent party for the Malays, especially the conservative rural Malays. And Bersatu essentially is catering to the same crowd. And so it wants to reclaim that kind of supremacy. Externally, external to the coalition is obviously Pakitan Harapan. If you remember, it was led by Mahathir Mohamad from 2018 to 2020. PH was in power, and then it was unceremoniously dumped because of an internal coup led by none other than Muhyiddin. And so now Anwar Ibrahim, the forever prime minister in waiting, wants to challenge Muhyiddin and basically try to get him back. Try to get the prime minister position that Mahathir had promised but failed to hand over. So really, both internal and external threats to Muhyiddin's position. And actually, a lot of these battles for political survival have really sapped the government's ability to focus on dealing with the pandemic proper. So if you remember, actually, it was not too long ago, actually about a year ago, prior to August, that Malaysia was actually handling the pandemic really well. But what happened in August last year was that, in July, August, was that Muhyiddin felt lucky. He felt like he could take a chance. The pandemic was being handled well. So he decided he was going to make a power play. He was going to try and remove the opposition government in Sabah. So what he did was he instigated a coup. The coup failed. They had to conduct a state election. The state election actually went Muhyiddin's way. But what happened was, because they had to hold a state election, that was when the COVID wave erupted. And it has persisted to this current day. So you could say that the current wave is in large part Muhyiddin's own making. And since then, the government's handling of the pandemic has been nothing short of disastrous. And it has created a lot of public discontent. I think you could see from the resumption of protests in Kuala Lumpur, in Putrajaya, the Lawan movement, which means fight in Malay, or the Kerajaan Gagal, which means failed government, the Black Flag movement. These are all indicators that the public is growing increasingly frustrated with this government that doesn't know what to do with the pandemic. On top of that, you have challenges from the royals, particularly the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, or the king. So in late July, what happened was the government announced in Parliament through the Law Minister Taqiyuddin Hassan that it had revoked emergency ordinances that had been put in place earlier to deal with COVID. What was the problem with that? Well, according to the Constitution, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet need to present the decree, need to present this revocation of the emergency ordinances to Parliament and put it to a vote for lawmakers to say yes. And they did not follow the due process. And so the king came out with a very strongly worded rebuke of the cabinet and of the prime minister, essentially saying that the law minister had misled Parliament. And this led to many calls within the ruling coalition, especially among Zahid's faction, as well as from the opposition for Muhyiddin to resign. And it created a constitutional crisis, a clash between the monarchy, which generally has adopted quite a neutral above politics kind of role, and the executive, which is led by Muhyiddin. And that's where we come to the current state. So as of last week, actually, the king said, okay, I'll give Muhyiddin a chance to redeem himself by allowing him to convene parliament in September and put a vote of confidence through. If he is able to get the support of at least 110 members of parliament, then he can continue to stay on prime minister. But what happened over the past week is that there were several UMNO leaders, mainly those belonging to Zahid's faction, that ordered that basically sent letters to the king saying that they had withdrawn support from Muhyiddin, which meant that he had less than 110 that he needed to stay in power. Two UMNO cabinet members also quit their positions, further signaling that they did not support Muhyiddin. So what happened yesterday was that the king actually told Muhyiddin, you can't wait until September, you have to call for parliament as soon as possible. And Muhyiddin then gathered all his allies to have a secret meeting, or rather not so secret meeting because it was covered by the media anyway, to actually discuss what they were going to do. So that's the latest state of play. And the next flash point I put here, which is the 6th to 30th September parliamentary sitting and the vote of confidence for Muhyiddin, that could very well take place in this month, possibly in the next 2 weeks. It will all depend on whether Muhyiddin decides to go ahead with convening parliament. And I put here contenders for the throne because essentially one of these three, one of these three could possibly, Zahid and Anwar are definitely vying for the throne. So these are the key players to watch. I move on quickly to the possible pathways, political scenarios, I think. The first one you see up there is the minority rule scenario, which is where we are right now. Muhyiddin has the support of about 100 lawmakers, which is not enough because, as I mentioned, the threshold is actually technically 112, but because 2 seats are absent right now and not been filled, so technically he needs 110. It could very well move into any of the 4 scenarios that we see here. The first is a fragile majority, which is essentially a return to what we had a few weeks ago, when Muhyiddin still held about 111 seats. And this could, and I've listed some triggers here for your consideration. The first is that if Zahid continues to call for Muhyiddin to be removed, but actually some UMNO members decide that it's a losing battle, they are going to switch back to Muhyiddin, or if Muhyiddin offers them cabinet positions and so on and so forth, he could very well, Zahid's call for revoke could very well lose momentum and Muhyiddin will again get the advantage. Or if Zahid is ousted in party polls. So UMNO is supposed to hold its party elections this year. It was delayed. Zahid decided to delay it, but now the Registrar of Society says that that's unconstitutional and therefore the party poll should be held immediately. And the main point is really Muhyiddin wants to play on tensions within UMNO to get Zahid out so that he doesn't have to deal with Zahid anymore. It could move into the UMNO redux situation where, if more UMNO cabinet members resign, Muhyiddin might be forced to concede that he has basically lost power. Or UMNO coalesces around the Deputy Prime Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob. So the DPM is usually seen as the next in line for the Prime Ministership. So that could lead us to the UMNO redux situation. Then we have the snap polls situation. So what happens if there's snap polls? What needs to take place if there are snap elections? So if there's an alternative Prime Minister candidate, for example, Anwar or Zahid, who looks like he's going to have more support than Muhyiddin, Muhyiddin in that situation can choose 2 things. He can either resign, which I don't think he will do, or he can advise the king to call for snap elections and therefore basically give him a chance to win at the elections and retain power. And this is rumored to be what Muhyiddin is trying to do exactly right now. He's trying to get the king to dissolve parliament. But I don't think the king will agree because the COVID situation is still pretty terrible. And to hold an election, as I mentioned earlier, like the Sabah state election, it could trigger an entirely new wave of infections that will cripple Malaysia even more. So I think this is less likely for now. Or, if Muhyiddin gets his way, he manages to somehow survive the vote of confidence in August, September, and about 70 to 80% of the country is fully vaccinated, potentially by the end of this year. Then Muhyiddin will feel like, he's in a better position. The public is not so angry at him anymore. Most of the country is protected against the Delta variant, and therefore he would be more likely to call for a snap election. and hopefully win a resounding mandate and be able to fend off these threats. Finally, you have opposition rule. So the opposition as a whole, with or without Zahid's faction, they back a single prime minister candidate, and in this case, potentially Anwar. Or if the country does go into a snap election, the level of public anger is so significant and so widespread that it essentially gives Pakitan a clear majority of votes, 120 seats possibly or more, as what we saw in 2018. And then you have an opposition-led government again, like in 2018 to 2020. So these are all the potential pathways. Right now, we think it's going to stay between minority rule and fragile majority. But like I said, the triggers here will show you the different conditions under which the situation could transition. So I'll talk a bit about the pandemic. So clearly there are a lot of worrisome indicators, obviously the rate of infections, the hospital and ICU utilization rates, which are about 90%, maybe even 95% in some states. And also the rate of brought in dead people, people who were brought in, they were dead, they did not get tested for COVID-19 before that. And right now, I think it's quite a worrying situation still. But vaccination is really key to Malaysia's ability to exit from this severe wave. And I guess if there is any good news to say about Malaysia at this point, it's really about the vaccinations. So obviously, Malaysia had a very slow start to vaccinations in the first half of this year. But since then, it's actually ramped up its vaccination rate. If you see the graph on the top right-hand corner, it shows that Malaysia's rate of vaccination of those administering the doses is the second highest in the region, only second to Cambodia. And it's administering about 500,000 doses per day. So that's something to note about Malaysia. And right now, about 25% of the population has been fully vaccinated. And if it continues at this pace, the government's target of vaccinating about 70 to 80% of the population by October earliest, if not the end of this year, is actually quite realistic. So the steady progress in the vaccination situation would result in a lesser need for complete lockdowns beyond the fourth quarter of this year. Of course, the wildcard still exists. Vaccine hesitancy in Malaysia is a thing. It could potentially cause the government to take longer to reach this vaccination target, as well as obviously new and more transmissible variants in 2022. So these are some of the wildcards to look at. Now just to move on to the price of politics, right? The business implications. So I just want to highlight three business implications of this battle for political survival. The first is really supply chain mismanagement. So there's a limited understanding of how supply chains actually work within the government. The government, the MCO that it has imposed over the course of the past few months, essentially highlights how the government does not understand supply chains. In order to create a product, you need different parts of the supply chain to work. But the government's MCO has essentially allowed some parts to work and other parts to essentially shut down. And that has created a lot of headaches for semiconductor manufacturers, suppliers, for MNCs that are relying on the supply chains, for the automotive sector especially. And a large part is really because of that limited understanding. There are ministers who understand, but they are not in the positions of power to really influence the decision-making process. So that's why I say it's reactive planning. Like for example, exemptions to semiconductor manufacturing that emerged in July was only granted after there was a severe backlash from the semiconductor industry, from local business associations. Poor communication or restriction changes as well. So many companies are not clear about the SOPs because the SOPs are vague. They are not precisely defined enough to let people know how to operate compliantly and efficiently, as well as inconsistent enforcement of rules. So some companies are penalized sometimes and some are not. The second one I want to raise is regulatory shock and awe. So because Muhyiddin doesn't want to go to Parliament, what happens is that there is very limited scrutiny on draft laws and regulations. They are essentially decided upon by Cabinet and then enacted as such. And therefore, these laws tend to be quite do not have the sensitivity to business needs as much as if the government had gone ahead to actually consult the different stakeholders in the private sector, in the public, and so on. And I just want to raise two examples. One is the government decision last year to revoke a cabotage exemption for foreign companies to help repair submarine cables, which is important for internet connectivity and stability. So until today, the government has continued to actually suspend the revocation, to suspend the exemption. And so that has actually deterred quite a number of foreign investors who are looking to invest in things like data centers, for example. And the second is, again, on data centers, the government is going to push out data center and cloud service operations regulations in the first half of next year. But actually, because there is no space for Parliament to discuss these rules, a lot of people don't know what the content is going to be like. And so that creates a lot of regulatory uncertainty for investors. So there is a risk of abrupt policy changes and arbitrary enforcement of rules, because simply there is very limited scrutiny on these laws. And the third is compliance ethics. So under Muhyiddin, the anti-corruption environment has really worsened because of a deepening politicization of state institutions, of GLCs, and so on. And so this has knock-on effects for businesses who have to face significant integrity challenges in their operations. Finally, to wrap it all up, I'll talk about how to respond, right? So I think in terms of supply chain mismanagement, a key ingredient of this is stakeholder engagement. So actually understanding whom in government you can approach, who you can rely on to help you problem solve. And it's important to cultivate and maintain these relations. And because the political scene is changing all the time, ministers get sidelined here and there, it's even more important to have an engagement strategy that actually evolves as the political changes take place. The second is to deal with the regulatory uncertainty. You need to be proactive in your monitoring and flagging of regulatory developments, news reports, or you need intelligence in another form to be able to tell you what is actually going on within the cabinet, who is discussing what regulations do they want to impose, what are the drafts and clauses that are going to be included in those regulations. You don't want to find out through a newspaper that suddenly your operations are impacted in one way or another. So you need to be proactive in your monitoring. Finally, in terms of compliance headaches, as the anti-corruption environment has worsened, the need for compliance gap reviews to identify parts of your operations where your staff may be confronted with requests for bribes, illicit payments, that is even more important. And you need to know how to rectify those gaps and also train internally to ensure that everyone understands what corruption looks like, in what form, in what measure, to what degree, which transactions, which interactions with whichever state agencies are more exposed to corruption risks. That is something that that you need to train on a very regular basis. I mean, we've held a couple of these anti-corruption simulation and training sessions for clients, and usually advise them, it should be done annually, or maybe once every 6 months, because you need to refresh that memory to ensure compliance. And so that essentially wraps up my presentation on Malaysia. I've written an article that expands more on these topics, and actually also talks a bit about how actually, despite all that is going on, there are still positives in Malaysia. There are still continuities in Malaysia that can still work for your business. So it's not a doom and gloom situation. There's also a podcast that I've just put up recently, which talks a bit more. So I invite you to visit our Control Risk website to find out more if you are so interested. So if any questions, I'm happy to take them later, or you can reach out to me on this email after this session. I'll now pass the time over to Khairul. Thank you.
Thanks, Harrison. Let me just share my slides. Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. So I think Harrison did a pretty good lowdown of the political scenario, and he said there's good news that also should be shared. So I'm hoping that in my presentation, I can share a little bit of those continuities and maybe some of the opportunities that companies continue to see in market. Anyway, by way of introduction, my name is Khairul Anwar. I oversee Enterprise Singapore's Southeast Asia operations. So we are a government agency, Enterprise Development Government Agency under MTI, and the bulk of our work is really helping Singapore companies internationalize, working to increase trade and innovation exchanges between Singapore and various Southeast Asian markets. In Malaysia in particular, our team is usually based in KL. Obviously, I think during the current scenario, most of us are working from home. So let me move to the next slide. So a quick outline of the presentation. I'll start off by just giving a quick overview again, just to set the background for the work that we do. And then moving on into the second section, which will form the bulk of my presentation today, which will really be about the sectors that our enterprises see opportunities in, both currently, or what we call evergreen sectors, and also emerging areas of interest. And then I'll cap off with a very brief, just one slide on outlook, really what Singaporean enterprises are looking out for in the coming year. Okay, so let me start off with the overview. I think on the whole, the Malaysian economy is recovering. So I think targeted growth this year is about 4.5%, which is a reversal from how they did last year, I think with a over 5% contraction. But itself, the 4.5% figure is a drop from, I think, the earlier Bank Negara prediction of about 6% odd, and that's largely attributable, I guess, to the Delta wave. Recovery is largely driven, I think, by FDI, return of FDI to key sectors, and also export growth, in particular, the electrical and electronic sector, which forms, I think, about 40% of Malaysia's external trade. So I have this slide here to just show everyone that Malaysia's situation is not unique. The Delta wave does continue to be a challenge to recovery and growth across many Southeast Asian countries, even countries that really had the situation down under control earlier this year before it mushroomed again. Therefore, I think the key takeaway here is that what we're facing in Malaysia and elsewhere is it's a dynamic situation. The numbers continue to be high, as Harrison mentioned, despite the stringent MCOs. I think that's really down to infectiousness, really pandemic fatigue at this point, and fatigue amongst populations to adhere to some of the more stringent rules, and then the need for the government to tread the balance between lives and livelihoods. As again, Harrison mentioned earlier, I think for us, the government's aggressive vaccination timeline, if they can carry it out by October or even the end of the year, is one of the positive signs to look out for as to the end of this current wave. So unsurprisingly, political stability and policy continuity are some of the conditions that are highly valued by businesses. So current uncertainty will, our view is that will present some headwinds to companies' investment and movement into Malaysia decisions. But interestingly, from the firms we've spoken to, both Singaporean and Malaysian firms, you have many companies that are quite sanguine about such developments. Come what may, for them, life and business goes on. So there is that demographic who are quite adept at operating whatever the environment is. And those partners do exist. And in ESG, I think we continue to connect Singapore companies to them even today. A few words about Malaysia and Singapore's economic relations, which most of you already know, but I think it's worth reiterating. So we are neighbors, deeply intertwined in terms of people and business linkages. Investment into Malaysia continues to grow, and Malaysia and Singapore continue to be each other's largest trading partners after China. So what this translates into, I think practically, as you've seen over the last year, has been a fairly close relationship between both governments in terms of ensuring that these interlinkages continue to work smoothly even during the pandemic, such as the flow of goods and labor that has really been a focus of both governments during the crisis. So zooming out or zooming in slightly, our company's interests remain focused on the major economic and urban centers, in this case, Klang Valley, Johor, Penang, with some interest now to actually look at regions further afield. So just prior to COVID, I think we had started to mount a few business missions to East Malaysia. Also some interim interest in the regions of Kedah, Perlis, Malacca, basically areas on the outskirts and benefiting from spillover effects of the major economic and urban centers. So let me move now and dive into what sectoral opportunities Singapore firms are looking at. So consumer, manufacturing, and the ICM sectors continue to be the main sectors our firms are looking at before the pandemic and also currently, and I would hazard to say, as we emerge out from the pandemic. Agri-tech and sustainable infrastructure, which I've listed there. Those are emergent areas. I have one slide each at the end just to talk about them. Areas that we're looking at and companies are starting to have conversations about, but I would say still limited or very niche pool of companies that are looking at them. So moving to the consumer sector. So the Malaysian consumer space is basically Singapore enterprises' comfort zone, right? Something they get and that they can serve competitively, as you can see from the spread of brands that are already present in the market. From the data that we gather in terms of companies applying to incentives to explore the market is also the top market globally for Singapore companies' first foray overseas. So the retail and F&B sector, as you all would know, I think it bore the brunt of the MCO and also in Singapore, the equivalent in Singapore too. But there are several bright spots. Digital delivery models, be it food delivery, cloud kitchens, e-commerce, they've done well as more folks turn to it during limited mobility scenarios. And much of this will be sticky post-pandemic too. For the offline sector, we do expect growth to surge post-lockdown due to pent-up demand. But we can't run away from, I think, some of the trends that were emerging even pre-COVID, which is the need to create attractive experiences for retail brands, and also the need to consider both online and offline options and integrating them into your business model. What we're also seeing is that the demand for luxury products and necessities, so basically the top and the bottom of the spectrum of products, also likely to be more resilient. So at ESG, what we've done over the last year has been to put together several partnerships to create landing pads for consumer firms to test the market in this new normal. So what you see here on this slide is two examples of the programs we've launched. We've got a program with Shopee and CapitaLand where we basically twin both an e-commerce and a physical pop-up approach and allow companies to basically wet their feet by going down both channels. And then the Food Panda and Smart City Kitchens program is really about building a lower capex model for entering and growing in the market by tapping on the smart kitchen networks, or the cloud kitchen networks, my bad. Looking at the ICM and digital space, so Malaysia has a long history of national digital transformation initiatives, as you can see on this timeline. And that continues to be the case with the recent launch of the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint. I think it was in February this year. And Bank Negara's move, I think, the last few weeks to issue up to 5 digital banking licenses. I think similar to the consumer sector, Malaysia is the first port of call for our ICM companies. In particular, over the last year, FinTech, specifically eKYC and InsurTech solutions have been an area of focus. If you've also, I think, followed the news, the bidding pool for the digital banking licenses has also included, I think, three consortia out of all bidders that have Singaporean components, really significant Singaporean components. So on a related note, we also actively engage Malaysia's tech startup ecosystem as one of our mandates at ESG is to connect Singapore's startup ecosystem more closely with other startup hubs. Malaysia's startup ecosystem is at a more emergent phase, for example, compared to down south in Indonesia, but it has grown in recent years with concerted attention from government, venture caps, and also the corporate venture capital field. Two angles to our work with startups include, on one hand, facilitating market access for Singapore companies to Malaysia. I think that's ongoing work and a large part of what we do across sectors. Specific to the tech startup space, the other angle of work has been engaging leading corporates in Malaysia who are keen to innovate to develop new growth engines in their businesses and looking to foster partnerships, either with Singaporean institutions on R&D or with tech solutions coming out of Singapore. So our first Southeast Asia Open Innovation Challenge, we trialed it last year, was launched last year and was executed at the beginning of this year. And Sunway was the Malaysian corporate that we collaborated with for that pilot run. And happy to say, I think that model has yielded some positive results. And there's a pilot on the way right now between Sunway and a Singaporean startup, and likewise for the 4 other corporates across the Southeast Asia. We're looking to grow that pool this year. And the flip side to it is that likely be covering more sectors, and therefore will appeal to more startups in a broader spectrum of sectors. Moving on to manufacturing. Malaysia is one of the more mature manufacturing locations in Southeast Asia in terms of its supply chain and talent base. So for us, manufacturing performance took a hit during the Delta wave, but we expected it should rebound as the economy reopens. We also expect Malaysia to be one of the beneficiaries of the China Plus One movement, with major nodes around Klang Valley, Iskandar, Penang, and their respective hinterlands continuing to be preferred bases. This holds true for Singapore-based firms too, which is why EDB and ESG together launched the Singapore Manufacturing Alliance earlier this year. And the intent really is to proactively engage with firms looking to move into Southeast Asia and connect them to a base and a supplier ecosystem. From Singapore's view, I think strengthening the manufacturing footprint in Southeast Asia is a win-win situation for all markets involved. So Malaysia's established manufacturing clusters that we referred to earlier, it's also one of the reasons I think it makes, one of the best prepared, it is one of the best prepared markets for the Industry 4.0 transformation. It has, over the last year or so, it's also been a go-to market for many of our manufacturing technology firms like Arcstone and Smart Factory Works. And we expect that to continue. And this is again one of the areas where once travel returns, we expect more visits and company visits to happen. So moving on to 2 of the emerging sectors. So just a brief note on each of them. On Agri-Tech, the 30 by 30 objective in Singapore has reinvigorated not just interest, but the pool of companies and startups that are active in this space. So for us, Malaysia and Indonesia are natural test beds, and we've been speaking to several corporates really on their interest to partner in Singapore to delve deeper into Agri-Tech, often to support current agricultural related business units. So given the important demographic that farmers represent in Malaysia and also the global push to make farming more productive yet less environmentally destructive, I think this is a space that we'll continue to watch and be active in. Likewise, on the solar front, Malaysia has been active across the solar value chain, from PV cell production to generation capacity. So in setting itself ambitious renewable targets for 2025, what it's done is to really kickstart demand for the sector. Large-scale solar projects is something the government has focused on, but on ESG's end, we focus, I think, a lot more of our time on direct demand from industrial and commercial customers that are looking to integrate solar PVs and ESS into their facilities. So wrapping up on the outlook. So instead of ending with putting my neck out there and making some predictions, I thought it'd be more useful to just lay out some markers that Singapore companies will look at or would regard as positive milestones in the coming months. So undoubtedly, seeing through the worst of COVID would be top of that list, and reopening successfully in some sort of endemic phase. That would, of course, include cross-border travel for Singaporeans, but also global travelers, which supports a lot of the consumer demand. Given the strong interest in the consumer space, I think fiscal support of some form to sustain consumer purchasing power during the recovery phase would be a positive in our company's books. Beyond recovery, looking at moves to boost competitiveness and productivity through encouraging digitalization and corporate innovation would be a positive sign for us, especially in the sectors we've highlighted earlier, consumer, manufacturing, and ICM, that most of our enterprises are bullish about. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Happy to take questions later. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Khairul, and thank you, Harrison, too, for your presentation. I mean, obviously a very important market for Singapore businesses and, of course, for international or multinational businesses that have presence in Malaysia. And it's encouraging to hear that despite all the political uncertainty, not to say drama, there are plenty of continuities. And I think, Khairul, you talked very eloquently about those in terms of all the different sectoral opportunities that are still very much there and alive and all have a future. So that's something that is encouraging from a business perspective. But Harrison, I just want to start with you first, if I may, and just ask you a question on what do you see as the key continuities from your perspective? Because I think you closed your presentation by saying that, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. There are plenty of continuities. Would you like to just share what you see as the key ones?
Thanks, Victor, and thanks, Khairul, for a really, really informative presentation. I think I just want to highlight a few continuities. I mean, the first is really what Khairul mentioned about, you know, how Malaysia is sort of a go-to, fairly comfortable landscape in terms of manufacturing, right? You know, Malaysia's transport logistics infrastructure is among the most advanced in the region. I mean, even if you compare it to Thailand, Thailand has been there for a long time, but Malaysia has always been home to many MNCs who have set up these manufacturing facilities in places like Johor, Penang, Selangor, of course, Klang Valley. And there's a reason why they continue to do that, even in the midst of the pandemic. Barring those supply chain issues that I mentioned, you know, the infrastructure is there, and the infrastructure is actually expanding and improving. So I think you will have seen that, you know, ever since Muhyiddin took power, there has been a resumption in some of the, you know, large-scale infrastructure projects. I think the key one is really the East Coast Rail Link, which is supposed to connect the west and east coast of Malaysia. And of course, the ECRL has triggered concerns among Singaporean lawmakers about whether Malaysia is going to create a trade route that will effectively, you know, not require exports to ever go through Singapore. It doesn't have to go all the way down to Singapore. It can just pass through Malaysia. And you know, the government here has had to think very hard about how to sort of mitigate that risk, you know, trying to be basically even more competitive than it already is right now. So I think those infrastructure projects have continued to push ahead. Of course, some of the infrastructure projects have had to be curtailed because of the pandemic and the impact on fiscal created the fiscal constraints. But broadly speaking, the trajectory of state spending on infrastructure is going to continue. The second is really how the government has embraced a lot of digital growth. You know, they're pushing for, like I said, new regulations in data centers, cloud services. Muhyiddin has laid out the My Digital initiative to essentially move 80% of data in the public sector onto a cloud system within the next 5 years. And quite a number of MNCs, quite a number of global tech players have really put in millions of, you know, promised millions of US dollars in investment in the coming years. You know, Bank Negara has been really quite progressive in terms of its thinking, right? Digital banking, fintech, creating that ecosystem. That's something that they have continued to do. Digitalization of supply chains in Malaysia is something that has been ongoing. The government has been pushing out many different rounds of incentives for SMEs, for factories to actually adopt increasing digitalization, especially during the pandemic where there are limits on employee capacity. So as you can see, the supply chain is actually modernizing and improving. It's not dissimilar to what the Singapore government has had to try to encourage the SMEs to do here as well, which is to adopt more technology in the way they operate. And I think, you know, what is lagging here is the development of regulatory frameworks to support these sectors, like whether it's 5G, whether it's data centers, cloud services, and so on. There are efforts that are going on, but I think some of this is being held up because of the political situation. You know, because things have been changing so quickly, they haven't had the time to actually focus their attention on making sure that these frameworks are updated, so that they can assure investors that, you know, the incentives are there for their investments. You know, there are regulations and clauses that actually shield investors from some of the risks that they are thinking about. For example, risks of, you know, state interference in the data that they hold in Malaysia. So I think those are some of the really important continuities to keep in mind.
Thank you very much. I'm competing with a renovation star downstairs, so if you hear lots of noise, it's nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the contractor. Khairul, I was fascinated to hear you talk about agri-tech Could you expand a little bit more on that? Because as you rightly pointed out, 30 by 30% of our food stuff, we're aiming to try and produce ourselves as a way of increasing food security for Singapore. How does that fit in with what you see happening across the causeway?
Thanks, Victor. Just at the renovation star downstairs. So the linkages between 30 by 30 and what we're likely to do across the causeway, they're not directly linked in the sense. 30 by 30 is all about increasing our self-sufficiency in the field of agri and aquaculture. But what it's done is to drive a lot of interest, a lot of capital, a lot of new startups, and a lot of young talent into the field. So where 3 years ago, maybe, we were looking at really many more traditional players, who are maybe today investing in Malaysia primarily in farms and sourcing from very traditional farms. We've started to have a lot more conversations now on the role of data in farming, the role that drones can play in health monitoring large plantations. We're looking at the quality of seeds. We're looking at vertical and urban farming. Aquaculture has obviously been a big, has gotten its place in the press, and likewise, I think it's something that we are likely to take in Malaysia. We've not had that as many conversations on the aquaculture side in Malaysia as agri, but likely, I think with the boom in that in Singapore, we're likely to also eventually take some of those companies just across the causeway.
Thank you. And one question I'm dying to ask: what is a cloud kitchen?
What is a cloud? Yeah, it took me a long time to figure that out. A cloud kitchen is basic. I think there's another name for it, which probably helps people understand it a bit better. But it's a little bit of a dark kitchen, right? Today you have a restaurant, and the kitchen's just behind the front of house. In a cloud kitchen, because you fulfill most of your orders by delivery riders, there's really no need to locate yourself in a mall, right? You can have all the facilities on the back end, enjoy cheaper rents, have a space that's more optimized for mass production. And that's really the concept that they're trying to tap on. And today, I think there are operators, cloud kitchen operators that operate cloud kitchens that many firms can take advantage of. So rather than each firm operating their own, they ride on the infrastructure, health and safety standards that these cloud kitchen operators have set up in a way, and they plug and play and sort of can tap on that infrastructure from the start.
So sort of central kitchen plus model.
Central kitchen plus on a rentable model.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. They both seem to be political, so let's have a look. Paul asks, what about the possibility of an interim unity government as mooted by Dr. Mahathir until the next general election in a couple of years or so? Do you see Anwar and Zahid collaborating? And what would be the preconditions for such collaboration? For example, the forgiveness, inverted commas, of Najib and Zahid's court cases.
Okay, I can take that. Thanks, Paul, for the questions. For me, I see the possibility of an interim unity government as fairly unlikely to happen. I think the interim unity government is a good solution in a sense, because it would theoretically stop the politicking and allow policymakers to focus on what they need to do for the pandemic and the economic implications. But it is also likely to be a thinly veiled attempt by Mahathir to regain power as Prime Minister. And of course, we have to think of the toxic nature of the political tensions right now between the many different warring parties to understand that a unity government would require those people to set aside their personal feuds and differences, their ideological differences, to work together. And actually, those personal feuds are quite serious. I mean, Mahathir still doesn't want Anwar to be Prime Minister. Yeah, he's 96, but he's still on his quest to try and make his son Prime Minister someday. Even though the opposition is all aligned against Muhyiddin, they are hardly aligned on who is supposed to replace Muhyiddin among them. So I think it's quite difficult to see an interim unity government come to power. And the thing about interim is that in Malaysia, interims can last very long. You can just look at the amount of backlash against Muhyiddin right now, and still he's in power. And it took a lot to dislodge Najib in 2018. It took a huge combination of factors: 1MDB, discontent with the cost of living, and a very unlikely alliance between Mahathir and Anwar in 2018 to bring that to happen. So the executive has a lot of power. So this interim unity government could essentially last for a long, long time. And the way Muhyiddin has tried to extend his rule by refusing to convene parliament, passing emergency ordinances without parliament's consent, I mean, it shows you that there's a lot of potential for abuse of power, even in an interim unity government. So it actually may not improve things. As for Anwar and Zahid, well, this is, I think there's always a possibility. They definitely have been talking despite their public denials. The preconditions, I think Anwar would demand that Zahid allow him to be prime minister. I don't think Anwar is going to, because he's 70 plus right now, he will not accept being a deputy prime minister again and rely on some flaky promise like what Mahathir had done, like Anwar telling Zahid, I'll wait 2 years and then you pass me the prime ministership. That's not going to happen. Anwar is not going to fall for the same thing twice. But if he does, then he really has nobody else to blame. But Zahid, yes, would most likely ask for his corruption charges to be dropped, and as well as potentially for Najib. Zahid in turn, would likely require Anwar to promise him quite a number of cabinet positions for the UMNO folks, and I think that will be the conditions for that setup. But I do not think that it is a stable arrangement by any means.
Thank you very much, Harrison. There's one more political question. Is the Pakitan Harapan coalition still strong, despite Anwar's attempt to take power? Is ASMIN considered a player in the ruling coalition?
Thanks, Ravi, for that as well. I think let's to answer the first question, we look at, maybe I can answer in two different aspects. One is internally, is it strong? I think PH internally is quite strong. They have pledged to support Anwar as the prime minister if they ever come to power. So they have not allowed their personal differences to get in the way of at least putting up a name. So I think internally they are quite strong. The DAP, even though it has 42 seats in parliament, the largest in the Pakitan administration, Pakitan coalition, even more than PKR, has come to terms with the reality that you're never going to have a Chinese prime minister, at least in the foreseeable future in Malaysia, and so it's willing to sort of allow Anwar and PKR to be the leading party in the coalition. There's quite a bit of leadership succession within the ruling coalition. I think within the DAP, you can see like Lim Guan Eng and Linkages have been leading DAP for many years now. Now they are sort of passing it on to a younger generation of leaders like Anthony Loke, the former transport minister. So I think internally, Pakatan is quite strong. Externally, I think if we answer it in terms of level of public support and electoral strength, I think that's a big question, because in 2018 when they won because of that backlash against Najib, but they sort of wasted some of their political capital during those 2 years when they were in power. They did not follow through on many of their campaign promises, which then created a lot of disillusionment among former Pakatan supporters. So I think because of that, I think their level of support is not very strong at this point. It's not a given that they will win the next election, just to put it that way. And the thing is that, most importantly, for Pakatan to win back federal power, they need to be able to convince the Malays to trust them, especially the conservative rural Malays. And the thing is that UMNO, Bersatu, PAS, they have played this, they have continued to court the conservative Malays and continue to play on racial and religious kind of themes. And I don't see them sort of losing faith in that and then switching their support for Pakatan anytime soon. I mean, it will really like UMNO and Bersatu really have to mismanage the entire situation for that kind of backlash to happen. And as whether for ASMI is considered a player in the ruling coalition, I mean, I think he is always considered an important player, but I do feel that right now he has to sit back and play a secondary role because he has nowhere else to go other than Muhyiddin's party. He can't go back to PKR because Anwar is in power and Anwar and Azmi completely hate each other. If there's one more person that Anwar hates more than Mahathir, it's Azmi. Azmi also cannot go to UMNO because nobody in UMNO likes it. And so really, right now he is sort of having to play second fiddle to the deputy prime minister. So I think that is, I think Azmi is someone to watch as always, but I think right now he's not as important as the other players.
Thank you very much. Angelina asks, what is the sentiment on the ground since Mahathir? How do you see this impacting business? So I guess it is, what is the influence of Dr. Mahathir now, and what impact, if any, will that have on business?
Sentiment on the ground since Mahathir. I think Mahathir's influence has certainly diminished since he resigned as prime minister in February last year. Right now, he is leading a political party, an opposition party of just four lawmakers. His claims of being able to be sort of the one to sort of rescue Malaysia, to make Malaysia great again, so to speak, do not hold as much ground as before, simply because of how people gave him a second chance from 2018 to 2020, and he did not do what he promised to do. Most of all, he failed to honor that central promise that led to the formation of Pakatan Harapan, linking up with his party, which was to actually honor that promise to hand over the prime ministership to Anwar. If he actually did that, we will not be in this situation. But because he failed to do that, he opened the way for people in his party in Bersatu, like Muhyiddin and Azmin, to engineer a defection and cause the downfall of his government. I think if you look at some of the by-elections that have taken place in Malaysia prior to COVID, you also see that it's quite clear that public support for Mahathir's party is also not strong. And so his electoral prospects, I think, would be fairly weak. The only way he can sort of propel himself to the top is if he makes himself a kingmaker, which is why I think that's his strategy now. Essentially, his best shot at becoming prime minister again, if that was ever possible, is to have an electoral outcome where nobody has the clear majority, and he would agree to support that coalition in exchange for being prime minister and putting his son Mukhris Mahathir as the deputy prime minister, possibly. But I think apart from that, it's quite unlikely that he will ever come back to power. But of course, in Malaysia, anything can happen, right? But I think that's my best call for now. How do you see this impacting business? I think, okay, I mean, there are many ways to answer this, but I think maybe I can answer it concisely in the sense that since Mahathir fell from power, what we have seen is a deepening of factionalism within the Malay parties, whether it's PKR, whether it's UMNO. And what this means is that it comes back to that scenario I was talking about earlier, which was that if you go to an election right now, it's actually quite likely, maybe 60% chance that you'll end up with a situation where nobody has a clear majority, and you essentially need very fragile, you'll create fragile coalition governments, similar to what you saw in what you see in Thailand, what you've seen in Thailand over the past few years, where basically there's a lot of negotiation and within the coalition, trading of promises and so on, in order to just be stable and stay in power. How does this impact business? Well, first of all, if you have a fragile coalition that's very focused on political survival, then you see the effects of that being, regulatory delays, the reforms are slower to come by. You always have a chance of no confidence vote whenever you convene parliament, which then creates a lot of problems in terms of passing legislation in order to improve the ease of doing business. And of course, whenever there is a change of government, as is the case right now in Malaysia, where the risk of a change is high, the risk of policy disruption and discontinuity is also fairly high. It may not be so high for sectors like manufacturing, where it's quite established. The policies and so on have been all set, but for the emerging sectors, that's where the disruption could happen. So, for example, 5G. Just a very brief example. Malaysia's 5G plan since Pakitan took power has changed massively 2 times in the space of 2 years. From an open tender for spectrum, for 5G spectrum, to a direct awarding of direct awarding of spectrum to various telcos, to now having Digital Nasional Berhad, which is a state-owned vehicle, who will own all the spectrum and then lease it out to telecommunications operators. Basically, a single spectrum holder. And many critics have come out to say, like, this is not sustainable. Most countries operate on at least two or more separate 5G networks, and relying on a single network is going to be extremely problematic and unstable. So these are just some of the examples of how policy discontinuity is a real risk whenever governments change, and it can create a lot of uncertainty for investors who are looking at long-term plans to invest in the country. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Harrison.
Victor, if you don't mind, I wanted to add a couple of lines to that.
Please do.
Yeah, so the sense we have is that I think what Malaysia is coming out from is you're looking at a generation of fairly stable and long-lasting leaders, to a model that, as Harrison was saying, if factionalism continues, becomes a little bit more, leaders may become more transient, you may have further changes. And on the business end, I think what that translates into, especially for larger firms, will be the need to develop the capability to build relationships and to navigate and to put your cards in different horses on an ongoing basis. And we see that in other markets that ESG is in, where the leaders and the political situation is maybe more complex. You're more likely to flip between parties very often. And it may be a skill set that we may have to start thinking about for firms that going big into Malaysia, they need to bet literally across the board.
Yeah, good point. And it just underscores again the complexities of many of the markets in ASEAN, and how different political systems, different legal systems are challenges that need to be managed. There's a couple more questions in the Q&A box. There's one on further scope for Ringgit depreciation relative to Sing dollars. That's a good one. Harrison, any thoughts on Ringgit depreciation because of the prolonged political uncertainty?
Well, I must claim that I am not an economic expert. And therefore, I do not understand the complexities and nuances of drivers of depreciation. Of course, this is not something that's new in terms of depreciation. I do think the political uncertainty is a factor, but it may not be the most important factor. In a sense, I think like what Khairul mentioned earlier in his presentation, some companies, some firms have, in a sense, been normalized to the idea of fluctuating politics in Malaysia. So it may not necessarily drive that depreciation to an even more severe degree. I think it would really take kind of like a serious regime change for even more severe depreciation. But otherwise, on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, where these reports of infighting and challenges to the Prime Minister go on, I think people, in a sense, they get desensitized and normalized to it. So I feel like my guess is that that there is further scope, but it's not as significant as we might think it would be.
Yeah, I was going to add that not something I look at closely also, but my sense is as long as external trade and FDI in Malaysia remain stable, I think the pressures on keeping the exchange rate stable will be there, and you've got a fairly activist bank negara.
Thank you. A slightly unfair one, Khairul, from Paul. Any latest developments about people movements between Singapore and Malaysia?
You know, if I knew, I've got 40 days of leave that I'm still waiting to use. The general, I mean, I can't give you a date, but the general trajectory would be that I think the leaders have already mentioned that they're committed to recognizing each other's vaccine passports. Malaysia, I think, has made a move in the last couple of weeks, allowing vaccinated individuals or nationals to quarantine at home upon coming back. When the gate is going to open, Singapore has that first batch of 7 countries, I think, that they're looking at for SHN free travel. And given the COVID situation in Southeast Asia right now, it's not going to be in that first batch. But fingers crossed, if the initial pilot goes well and COVID comes under some sort of control or endemic status in Malaysia, I think that's the milestone I would look at.
Yeah, if I may add also, one thing that I didn't mention was actually important was the choice of vaccines that Malaysia has relied on. So they're relying on at least 50% of Pfizer. And of course, that could make all the difference as we deal with the Delta variant. At least Pfizer and Moderna have shown to be more effective in dealing with Delta. So I think that's important to note, because if you look at across the region, for example, Indonesia or Thailand, they have been relying much more heavily on Sinovac. Malaysia has already said that it will discontinue use of Sinovac as once the current supplies are exhausted, and they will rely more on Pfizer. They have approved Moderna over the past month. I think Johnson & Johnson and so on. So I think that is an important factor to consider when we think about opening of borders, because I guess it's more likely that those countries that rely on the vaccine mix that leans more on the mRNA vaccines would be more likely to open up than those that are not. I mean, even Thailand right now, relying on AstraZeneca, Thailand's situation, I think, is much more severe. Yeah, I think only about 6% of the population has been fully vaccinated, which is going to definitely affect their tourism reopening, regardless of whatever took place in Phuket earlier this year.
I'd like to close by just inviting both of you to just in a couple of minutes each, just to answer the following question. What key advice would you give businesses today when they're looking either to expand into Malaysia or to enter Malaysia? You want to go first, Harrison?
Oh, okay. I can go first. Okay. I think first is continue to invest in the relationships with stakeholders in the country. I think I echo what Khairul said just a while ago about having to navigate that stakeholder landscape and maintaining those relationships, especially as the political players move in and out. Because, like I said, the pandemic is right now at the foremost of everybody's minds. But if the vaccination plan goes as planned, this too shall pass, right? And we will probably be back in the situation where Malaysia is still a key manufacturing and export hub in Southeast Asia, and you don't want to just give up right now and then forsake all the future potential that the country has to offer. And then the second one would be to understand your supply chain. Understand your supply chain in Malaysia in a more detailed way than if you were just relying on secondhand information about suppliers, for example, in that country. So understand where your constraints are, what drivers are affecting it, so that you can take steps to mitigate it. I give you a very concrete example. Different states in Malaysia are opening up at different rates. So if you are looking to mitigate shortages, you need to identify which states are opening up faster. What's the on the ground reality for your suppliers, so that you can shift your supply chains around to make sure that you can still meet your production volumes. And that's something you need to do like right now. You can't just wait for the vaccinations to be completed to do it. I mean, right now you're facing those pressures, so you need to take that action. So I think those are two things that I would just advise our listeners on today.
Thanks, Harrison. Khairul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I can add on a couple of others. Just to echo Harrison's point on supply chain risks, given Singapore's experience, I think over the last with the first MCO and circuit breaker, I think that's something that companies should start working into their BCPs if you haven't already. Very useful, and it's something that we've been working with all our SMEs to build into their work plans. The second thing to look out for would be, I mean, I would term it under the rubric of a big reset for the sectors, especially for the consumer sector. What we've seen in the consumer sector is a lot of companies harmed or at least very badly injured by rounds of the MCOs. And what you're going to end up with emerging from COVID is a mix of pent-up demand with some firms that just don't have spare capital to respond to that. So you're going to see a little bit of a DNA mixing in malls, online, and sort of in stores, and companies got to think carefully about what does a big reset mean for them, and then what are gaps that are going to free up or open up in that ecosystem, whether you're in F&B or whether you're in food products or whether you're in retail, that will give you the space to do things that you maybe had not considered doing before COVID. So we do expect some of that because of the firms that have gone out of business and the firms that are likely to be quite financially stressed coming out of COVID. The third area is really generic advice that we give everyone, which is in expanding to markets, it's better to do things earlier rather than later. So although your plans may be a year ahead, 2 years ahead, I mean, come and talk to us, start looking at identifying partners, start building the ability to interact with Malaysia and Malaysia's system, which may be something that is not completely natural for someone from a very sterile, organized environment coming out of Singapore. So you wanna acclimatize yourself, your teams to it, and it does take some time. So spend COVID well, and spend the COVID period well by trying to have these conversations, build these teams, sort of ahead of the horses being let out the block.
Thank you, Khairul, and thank you, Harrison. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you too for your company. The Chamber is here to help. So if there's any topic or theme or anything at all that we can help you with, don't hesitate to contact us at heretohelp@sicc.com.sg. We've got a terrific lineup of events, most of them webinars for the next few months, and we look forward to your company. And until then, I'm no longer going to compete with the contractor downstairs. I'm going to wish you all a very good morning. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Victor. Harrison. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.